Imagine sitting at your family's Thanksgiving dinner, surrounded by success stories and accomplishments, when your father looks directly at you and says, "Well, at least Marcus and Sarah turned out right," while your mother nods in agreement, as if you're not even there. What if I told you that 20 years later, that same disappointment would be sitting across from the FBI director as he leaned forward and said, "Ma'am, what are your orders?" Yeah, this story goes places you won't expect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation to my nephew's graduation party arrived on standard cardstock. Nothing fancy, just the kind of thing my sister Sarah would send out for family gatherings. Join us in celebrating Tyler's acceptance to Harvard Law School. It read in neat print that probably came from her home printer. I stared at the invitation for a long time, knowing exactly what kind of evening awaited me. Another family gathering where I'd be the topic of whispered conversations and disappointed sighs. I was 32 years old, living in a studio apartment in downtown Denver, working what my family called another one of those temporary jobs at a small cybersecurity consulting firm. To them, I was the sister who'd never quite figured it out, the daughter who'd disappointed them at every turn, the family embarrassment who still hadn't found her path in life while her siblings collected advanced degrees and impressive job titles like trophies. My brother Marcus was a cardiologist, married to another doctor, living in a house that could have been featured in Better Homes and Gardens. My sister Sarah was a successful attorney with a corner office downtown, married to a financial advisor, with 2 kids who were already showing signs of following in their parents' overachieving footsteps. Then there was me, Kyla, the black sheep who dropped out of college twice, worked a string of jobs that never seemed to lead anywhere, and had what my mother delicately referred to as, quote, commitment issues when it came to relationships. The drive to my parents' house in Springfield took 45 minutes. 45 minutes of rehearsing conversations in my head and preparing for the inevitable questions about my life choices. The neighborhood hadn't changed much since I'd grown up there. Still the same manicured lawns and 2-story colonials where successful middle-class families raised their successful middle-class children. My Honda Civic looked modest next to Marcus's BMW and Sarah's Mercedes in the driveway, a visual reminder of the gap between their lives and mine. The front door opened before I could knock, and my mother Linda appeared wearing her best hostess smile, the one she reserved for occasions when she wanted to project the image of family harmony. "Kyla, sweetheart, you made it," she said, pulling me into a hug that felt more performative than genuine. "Everyone's in the living room. Tyler's been telling us all about his internship applications." The living room was exactly as I'd expected, filled with relatives I saw maybe twice a year, all dressed in the kind of business casual attire that suggested professional success and financial stability. Tyler, Sarah's 18-year-old son, stood near the fireplace holding court with stories about his college plans, while adults nodded approvingly and asked the kinds of questions that reinforced his sense of achievement. I found a spot near the edge of the group, nursing a glass of wine and listening to conversations about investment portfolios and vacation homes in Colorado ski towns. These gatherings always made me feel like I was watching a movie about someone else's life, observing from the outside while everyone else played roles I'd never quite learned to perform. "Kyla." My Aunt Rebecca appeared at my elbow with the kind of smile that preceded awkward questions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "How are things going with your computer work? Still enjoying that?" The way she said computer work made it sound like a hobby rather than a career, which was fairly typical of how my family viewed my job. They'd never quite understood what cybersecurity consulting involved, and I'd long since stopped trying to explain the complexity of protecting organizations from digital threats. "It's going well," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "We're working on some interesting projects right now." "That's nice, dear. Still living in that little apartment downtown?" There it was, the gentle probe disguised as polite interest. My little apartment had become family shorthand for my failure to achieve the kind of material success that Marcus and Sarah had accumulated by their early 30s. The fact that I'd chosen to live simply while I figured out my career path was viewed as evidence of my inability to adult properly. "I like being downtown," I said. "Short commute, lots of restaurants and coffee shops nearby." Rebecca nodded with the kind of expression people wear when they're trying to find something positive to say about a situation they don't understand. Well, that's practical, I suppose. The conversation was interrupted by my father's voice calling for everyone's attention. Robert stood near the fireplace with Tyler, holding a glass of beer and wearing the proud grandfather expression he'd perfected over years of celebrating his grandchildren's achievements. "I'd like to make a toast," he announced, waiting for the room to quiet down. "To Tyler, who's made us all so proud with his acceptance to Harvard Law School, following in his mother's footsteps and showing us what dedication and hard work can accomplish." Everyone raised their glasses while Tyler beamed with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his path in life. I joined the toast, genuinely happy for my nephew while simultaneously feeling the familiar sting of being excluded from the family narrative of success and achievement. "Tyler's always been focused," Sarah said, her voice carrying across the room with lawyer-like authority. "Even in high school, he knew exactly what he wanted and worked systematically toward his goals. It's wonderful to see young people who understand the value of planning and commitment." The comment wasn't directed at me specifically, but everyone in the room understood the subtext. Sarah had always been subtle about expressing disappointment in my choices, preferring implication to direct criticism. She was the sister who'd had her life mapped out by age 16, who'd never wavered from her predetermined path, who viewed my career changes and life experiments as evidence of character flaws rather than exploration. Marcus stepped forward to add his own congratulations, talking about the importance of choosing a profession that provided both intellectual challenge and financial security. As a doctor, he spoke with the authority of someone who'd never questioned the value of his career choice, never wondered if there might be other ways to measure success besides salary and social status. I listened to the speeches and congratulations while thinking about the conversation I'd had with my supervisor David earlier that week. Our small cybersecurity firm had been approached by a federal agency about a consulting contract that could change the trajectory of our business significantly. The details were still confidential, but David had hinted that it was the kind of opportunity that could establish our company as a major player in government cybersecurity work. "Kyla's here too," my mother announced suddenly, as if just remembering my presence. "She's still doing her computer consulting work in Denver." The way she said it made my work sound like a side hustle rather than a legitimate career. But I forced myself to smile and acknowledge the scattered polite responses from relatives who had no idea what to make of my professional life. In their world, success was measured by traditional metrics: advanced degrees, prestigious job titles, houses in good neighborhoods, retirement accounts that grew steadily, year after year. "What exactly do you do with computers, Kyla?" asked my Uncle Jim, a retired engineer who'd spent his entire career with the same manufacturing company. "Is it like tech support?" I'd fielded this question so many times that I'd developed a standard response that was accurate but simplified enough for family gatherings. "I help organizations protect their digital systems from cyber attacks. We analyze security vulnerabilities and develop strategies to prevent data breaches and other security incidents." "Oh, like antivirus software," Jim said, nodding as if he'd figured out the mystery. "Something like that," I replied, not having the energy to explain the difference between consumer antivirus programs and enterprise cybersecurity consulting. These conversations always made me feel like I was speaking a different language, trying to translate complex technical concepts into terms that made sense to people who'd built their careers in more traditional fields. The party continued around me while I found myself gravitating toward the edges of conversations, listening more than participating, observing the family dynamics that had shaped my sense of myself for most of my life. Tyler continued to hold court with stories about his college plans, while adults offered advice about law school and legal careers. Sarah and Marcus dominated conversations about professional achievements and family milestones, while I remained largely invisible unless someone made a deliberate effort to include me. It wasn't that my family was cruel or deliberately exclusionary. They loved me in their way, but they'd never quite known what to make of me. I was the daughter who'd changed majors 3 times before dropping out of college, who'd worked as a bartender while teaching herself programming, who'd turned down a stable job with a large corporation to join a startup that most people had never heard of. Kyla's always been different, I'd heard my mother explain to relatives over the years, using the tone people reserve for discussing family members who've made choices they can't quite understand. "She's very bright, but she's never been able to settle on what she wants to do with her life." The assessment wasn't entirely wrong, but it missed the complexity of my journey. I hadn't been unable to settle on a career path. I'd been searching for work that felt meaningful rather than just financially rewarding. The jobs I'd left hadn't been failures so much as steps toward understanding what I actually wanted to do with my skills and interests. My path to cybersecurity had been unconventional. After dropping out of college the second time, I'd worked nights at a downtown bar while spending my days learning programming languages and studying network security. The bar job had been a means to an end, providing flexible income while I developed technical skills that traditional education hadn't offered. Most of my family saw the bartending as evidence that I'd given up on having a real career. But for me, it had been a strategic choice that allowed me to pursue learning on my own terms. The breakthrough had come 2 years earlier, when I'd helped the bar owner investigate suspicious activity on their point-of-sale system. What started as a favor for my boss turned into discovering a sophisticated credit card skimming operation that had been running for months. The investigation led to arrests and recovered thousands of dollars in fraudulent charges, but more importantly, it connected me with David Chen, a cybersecurity consultant who'd been hired by the police to analyze the technical aspects of the crime. David had been impressed enough with my work to offer me a position with his consulting firm, despite my lack of formal credentials in cybersecurity. He'd seen something in my approach to problem-solving that traditional education hadn't captured, a combination of technical skill and investigative instinct that he said was rare in the field. Working with David's firm had been revelatory. For the first time in my professional life, I was doing work that felt both challenging and important. We helped small businesses protect themselves from cyber threats, investigated security breaches for law enforcement agencies, and developed training programs for organizations that needed to improve their cybersecurity awareness. Every day brought different challenges that required creative problem-solving and technical expertise. But try explaining that to relatives who measured career success by job titles and salary figures. My work didn't fit into neat categories that made sense at family gatherings. I wasn't a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer with a clear professional identity that people could easily understand and respect. Maybe Kyla will go back to school eventually, I'd overheard my mother telling a neighbor a few months earlier. Get a degree in something practical that could lead to stable employment. The assumption that my current work wasn't stable or practical reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of both my career and the cybersecurity industry in general. Our firm was growing rapidly, the demand for cybersecurity services was increasing every year, and I was developing expertise in an area that was becoming increasingly critical for organizations of all sizes. As the party wound down and people began making their departure plans, I found myself in the kitchen helping my mother clean dishes, a ritual that usually provided an opportunity for the kind of direct conversation we rarely had in front of other family members. "Tyler's going to do very well in law school," Linda said, scraping plates and loading them into the dishwasher with efficient movements that spoke to years of hosting family gatherings. "Sarah's so proud of how focused he's been throughout high school." "He should be proud," I agreed, genuinely meaning it. "Harvard Law is incredibly competitive. It's wonderful when young people know what they want and work toward it systematically," she continued, and I could feel the familiar lecture building. "Sarah always knew she wanted to be a lawyer. Marcus always knew he wanted to be a doctor. They set goals and achieved them." The implication was clear, even if she didn't say it directly. I was the daughter who'd never known what she wanted, who'd drifted from one thing to another without the kind of focused determination that characterized my siblings' career paths. "I think I'm finally figuring out what I want too," I said, testing the waters for a conversation about my work that might go beyond surface-level politeness. "That's good, sweetheart. It's never too late to find direction." The response was encouraging but cautious, the tone of someone who'd heard similar statements from me before and was reserving judgment about whether this time would be different. I couldn't blame her for the skepticism. From her perspective, I'd spent most of my 20s and early 30s making choices that seemed random and unproductive. "The cybersecurity work has been really engaging," I continued. "We're working on some projects that could have significant impact." "That's wonderful. Are you thinking about going back to school to get a degree in that field?" There it was again, the assumption that legitimate career paths required formal education, that my self-taught expertise and practical experience weren't sufficient credentials for serious professional work. I'd encountered this attitude throughout my journey into cybersecurity, from potential clients who questioned my qualifications to family members who couldn't quite believe that someone could build expertise without traditional educational credentials. Actually, the experience I'm getting is probably more valuable than what I'd learn in a classroom, I said, trying to keep defensive feelings out of my voice. Cybersecurity is such a rapidly evolving field that real-world experience with current threats is often more relevant than academic knowledge. Linda nodded with the polite expression she wore when I talked about my work, clearly not understanding enough about the field to evaluate my explanation but wanting to be supportive anyway. Well, as long as you're happy with what you're doing, she said, which was family code for, I don't understand your choices, but I'm not going to argue about them anymore. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah entering the kitchen with an armload of glasses from the living room. She moved with the efficient confidence of someone accustomed to managing multiple tasks simultaneously, her lawyer training evident in the way she organized even simple domestic activities. "Great party, Mom," Sarah said, beginning to load glasses into the dishwasher with systematic precision. Tyler was so happy to have everyone here to celebrate with him. "He deserves to celebrate," Linda replied. 18 years old and already accepted to one of the best law schools in the country. You and Mark should be very proud. We are. It's amazing what kids can accomplish when they set clear goals and work consistently toward them. The comment was directed at our mother, but I felt the familiar sting of implied criticism. Sarah had always been generous with advice about life management and goal setting, usually delivered in ways that highlighted the contrast between her systematic approach to career building and my more exploratory path. "Kyla was just telling me about her computer work," Linda said, clearly trying to include me in the conversation. "She thinks the experience she's getting is very valuable." Sarah turned toward me with the kind of interested expression that lawyers use when they're gathering information for analysis. "What kind of projects are you working on these days?" It was the first time in months that she'd asked a specific question about my work, rather than offering general encouragement or gentle suggestions about career planning. I decided to take the opportunity to share some details about the federal consulting opportunity that David had mentioned. "We've been approached about a potential contract with a federal agency," I said, keeping my voice casual despite the significance of the opportunity. "It's still in early stages, but it could be a major project for our firm." Sarah's expression shifted slightly, moving from polite interest to something that looked more like genuine attention. As someone who'd built her legal career working with government agencies, she understood the significance of federal contracts in ways that other family members might not. "What kind of federal agency?" she asked, her lawyer instincts engaging with the kind of follow-up question that suggested real interest rather than social politeness. "I can't share specifics yet because of confidentiality agreements," I replied, "but it's related to cybersecurity infrastructure protection." "That sounds important," Linda said, though her tone suggested she didn't fully understand what cybersecurity infrastructure protection involved. Sarah, however, was looking at me with an expression I'd rarely seen from her, something that resembled respect mixed with curiosity. "Federal cybersecurity work is becoming increasingly critical," she said slowly. "The kinds of threats organizations face now are incredibly sophisticated." It was the first time I could remember Sarah acknowledging that my work might be important, rather than just interesting or different. The validation felt significant coming from someone whose opinion had shaped my sense of professional legitimacy for most of my adult life. "The field is evolving so rapidly that experience with current threat patterns is often more valuable than traditional credentials," I continued, feeling emboldened by her apparent interest. "A lot of the most effective cybersecurity professionals are people who've learned through hands-on work rather than formal education." "That makes sense," Sarah said, and I could see her lawyer mind processing this information and connecting it to her own understanding of professional expertise. "Some of the best legal professionals I know developed their skills through practical experience rather than just academic study." The comparison caught me off guard. Sarah had never before drawn parallels between my work and legitimate professional fields that she respected. For most of our adult lives, she'd treated my career choices as fundamentally different from the traditional professional paths that she and Marcus had followed. "Well," Linda said, clearly pleased to see her daughters having a substantive conversation about work, "it sounds like you're both doing important things in your own ways." The comment was diplomatically neutral, but it represented a subtle shift in how my mother framed my career relative to Sarah's. Instead of treating my work as a placeholder until I found a real profession, she was acknowledging it as legitimate in its own right. As we finished cleaning up and prepared to leave, I found myself thinking about the conversation differently than I'd expected. Family gatherings usually left me feeling frustrated and misunderstood, but tonight had included moments of genuine interest in my work that I'd rarely experienced from Sarah or my mother. The drive back to Denver gave me time to process the evening and think about the federal consulting opportunity that David had mentioned. He'd been vague about details, but the tone of his conversation suggested that it was the kind of project that could establish our firm as a significant player in government cybersecurity work. More importantly, it was the kind of opportunity that might finally provide the external validation that my family needed to understand that my unconventional career path had led somewhere meaningful. I'd spent years feeling like the family disappointment, the daughter who couldn't quite get her life together while her siblings accumulated traditional markers of success. But what if my path had been leading towards something that none of us had anticipated? What if all the jobs that had seemed like random experiments had actually been building toward expertise in a field that was becoming increasingly important for national security and organizational protection? As I pulled into my apartment building's parking garage, I made a decision to call David first thing Monday morning and tell him that I was interested in whatever federal opportunity he'd mentioned. Whether or not it led to the kind of career breakthrough I'd been working toward, it was time to stop apologizing for my unconventional path and start embracing the expertise I'd developed through years of exploration and hands-on learning. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of determination that had been building throughout the weekend. The conversation with Sarah had crystallized something important for me about the value of my work and the legitimacy of my career path. For too long, I'd allowed other people's definitions of success to shape my sense of professional worth. But I was finally beginning to understand that expertise and impact mattered more than traditional credentials or family approval. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made Denver feel alive with possibility. I sat in my studio apartment with a cup of coffee, staring at my phone and rehearsing what I'd say to David about the federal opportunity he'd mentioned. The conversation with Sarah had shifted something fundamental in how I viewed my career trajectory, and I was ready to stop treating my work as temporary and start building something significant. David's office was located in a converted warehouse in the River North District, the kind of industrial chic space that tech companies favored for its combination of affordability and aesthetic appeal. Our firm occupied the third floor, an open workspace filled with high-end computers, multiple monitors, and the kind of sophisticated equipment that made our cybersecurity work possible. When I arrived at 8:30, David was already at his desk, surrounded by printouts and technical manuals that suggested he'd been working for hours. "Kyla, perfect timing," he said, looking up from his computer screen with the expression of someone who'd been waiting for this conversation. "I was hoping you'd come in early today. We need to talk about something that could change everything for our company." David Chen was in his mid-40s, a former federal cybersecurity specialist who'd left government work 5 years earlier to start his own consulting firm. He had the kind of technical expertise that came from years of working on classified projects, combined with the business acumen necessary to build a successful private practice. More importantly, he'd always treated me as an equal partner in our work, rather than a junior employee who needed constant supervision. "I've been thinking about that federal opportunity you mentioned," I said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I'm very interested in hearing more details." David's expression shifted to something more serious, and he glanced around the office to make sure we were alone before continuing. "What I'm about to tell you is highly confidential, Kyla. The kind of information that requires security clearances and background investigations. Are you prepared for that level of commitment?" The question caught me off guard. I'd expected to hear about a consulting contract, not something that required security clearances. "What exactly are we talking about here, David?" He pulled out a folder marked with official government seals and opened it carefully. 3 weeks ago, I received a call from the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. They're developing a new program to protect critical infrastructure from sophisticated cyber attacks, and they need private contractors with specialized expertise to help implement it. I leaned forward, my attention completely focused on what he was saying. What kind of critical infrastructure? Power grids, water treatment facilities, transportation systems, financial networks. The kind of infrastructure that keeps society functioning. The threats we're seeing now are unlike anything we've dealt with before. State-sponsored attacks that could potentially shut down entire regions of the country. The scope of what he was describing was staggering. I'd worked on cybersecurity projects for small businesses and local government agencies, but this was something entirely different. This was national security work that could affect millions of people. They specifically requested you for this project, Kyla, David continued, his voice carrying a weight that made me realize how significant this opportunity actually was. Apparently, someone in federal law enforcement has been following your work on the credit card fraud investigation and some of the other cases you've worked on. Your approach to pattern recognition and threat analysis has impressed people in very high places. I felt a mixture of excitement and intimidation that was unlike anything I'd experienced in my professional life. Someone in federal law enforcement knows about my work? More than knows about it. They've been studying your methodologies and recommending you for projects that require exactly the kind of innovative thinking you bring to cybersecurity challenges. David explained that the Department of Homeland Security was assembling a small team of specialists to work on what they called the Critical Infrastructure Protection Initiative. The program would involve analyzing vulnerabilities in essential systems, developing new security protocols, and training personnel throughout the federal government on advanced cyber threat detection. This isn't just a consulting contract, he said, his voice becoming more serious. This is an opportunity to help shape national cybersecurity policy. The recommendations that come out of this program will influence how the federal government protects critical infrastructure for years to come. The weight of responsibility that came with such an opportunity was both thrilling and terrifying. I'd spent years feeling like my career was building towards something significant, but I'd never imagined it might lead to work that could affect national security policy. What would my role be specifically? I asked, trying to wrap my head around the transition from small business consulting to federal cybersecurity work. Lead analyst for threat pattern recognition, David replied. You'd be responsible for identifying emerging attack vectors, analyzing the tactics that sophisticated adversaries use to penetrate critical systems, and developing countermeasures that can be implemented across multiple types of infrastructure. The job description sounded like something from a spy novel, rather than the natural next step in my consulting career. David, I don't have security clearances or formal training in federal cybersecurity protocols. How can they be considering me for something this important? He smiled with the expression of someone who'd asked himself the same question. Because the threats we're facing now don't respond to traditional approaches. The adversaries we're dealing with are using techniques that weren't covered in any textbook or government training program. They need people who can think creatively about problems that have never been solved before. David pulled out another document from the folder, this one containing what looked like a preliminary background investigation form. If you're interested, the process starts with a comprehensive background check and interviews with federal security investigators. They'll examine every aspect of your personal and professional history to determine your eligibility for security clearances. The thought of federal investigators examining my unconventional career path and personal life was intimidating, but it was also validating in a way I hadn't expected. Someone in the federal government thought my skills were valuable enough to justify the extensive process required to bring private contractors into classified work. There's something else you should know, David continued. This program is being overseen directly by the FBI's Cyber Division. If you're selected for the team, you'll be working closely with some of the most senior cybersecurity officials in the federal government. The mention of the FBI made the opportunity feel even more surreal. 6 months ago, I'd been explaining to my family that cybersecurity consulting was a legitimate career. Now I was being considered for work that would put me in regular contact with federal law enforcement leadership. How long do I have to decide? I asked, though I already knew what my answer would be. They need a response by the end of the week. If you're interested, I can initiate the background investigation process immediately. The program is scheduled to begin in January, which gives us about 10 weeks to complete the security clearance procedures. I thought about the conversation with Sarah at Tyler's graduation party, about her surprise when I'd mentioned federal cybersecurity work, about the years of feeling like the family disappointment who couldn't quite get her life together. This opportunity represented everything I'd been working toward without fully realizing it. I'm interested, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. Whatever this process involves, I'm ready for it. David's expression shifted to something that looked like pride mixed with concern. "Kayla, I want you to understand what you're committing to. This kind of work changes your life in fundamental ways. Once you have security clearances and access to classified information, you can't talk about your work with friends or family. Your professional relationships become different because you're dealing with information that most people can never know about." The warning was sobering, but it also reinforced how significant this opportunity actually was. I'd spent years feeling like my work was invisible to my family because they didn't understand cybersecurity consulting. Now I was being offered work that would be invisible for entirely different reasons. "I understand," I replied. "I've never been someone who needed to share every detail of my professional life anyway." Over the following weeks, I found myself immersed in the most comprehensive background investigation I'd ever experienced. Federal investigators interviewed former employers, college professors I hadn't spoken to in years, neighbors from apartments I'd lived in during my 20s. They reviewed financial records, travel history, personal relationships, and every job I'd held since turning 18. The process was intrusive, but also strangely validating. For the first time in my professional life, someone was taking my career history seriously enough to examine it in detail. The investigators seemed particularly interested in my unconventional path into cybersecurity, asking detailed questions about how I developed technical skills outside of formal educational programs. "Your approach to self-directed learning is actually quite valuable for this type of work," explained Agent Jennifer Martinez, the FBI investigator who conducted my primary security interview. "The adversaries we're dealing with don't follow conventional patterns, so we need analysts who can think outside traditional frameworks." Agent Martinez was a woman in her 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that suggested years of experience in complex investigations. She'd spent 2 hours asking questions about my professional development, personal relationships, and motivations for pursuing cybersecurity work. "One thing that stands out in your background is your ability to identify patterns that others miss," she continued. "The credit card fraud investigation that brought you to David's attention demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical thinking we need for critical infrastructure protection." The validation from someone with her credentials was more meaningful than years of family approval could have been. Here was a federal law enforcement professional explaining that my unconventional career path had actually prepared me for work that required specialized skills and innovative thinking. "Can you tell me more about what this program will actually involve?" I asked, though I knew she was limited in what details she could share with someone who didn't yet have security clearances. "Critical infrastructure protection requires understanding how sophisticated adversaries think about vulnerability exploitation," she explained carefully. "You'll be analyzing attack patterns, developing threat models, and working with technical teams to implement security measures that can protect essential systems." The work sounded both challenging and important in ways that my previous consulting projects had only hinted at. Instead of helping individual businesses protect themselves from cyber threats, I'd be working to protect systems that millions of people depended on every day. 3 weeks into the background investigation process, I received a call from David that would change the trajectory of my entire career. He sounded different than usual, his voice carrying the kind of excitement that comes from unexpected opportunities. "Kyla, I just got off the phone with Agent Martinez," he said without preamble. "Your background check is proceeding faster than anyone expected, and they want to expedite your clearance process." "Why the rush?" I asked, though I was already starting to pack my laptop bag in case this conversation led to immediate travel. "There's been a significant cyber incident involving power grid infrastructure on the East Coast. Nothing that's made the news yet, but the kind of sophisticated attack that demonstrates exactly why this program is necessary. They want you in Washington by Thursday to observe the response and analysis procedures." The opportunity to observe a real federal cybersecurity response was both thrilling and intimidating. "David, I don't have clearances yet. How can I be involved in active incident response?" "They're bringing you in as an observer, with temporary access to unclassified analysis procedures. It's essentially a working interview to see how you handle high-pressure situations and complex technical challenges." Washington in November was cold and gray, with the kind of weather that made government buildings feel even more imposing than usual. The Department of Homeland Security's headquarters was a massive complex that embodied the seriousness of federal security work. I'd never been inside a federal office building before, and the layers of security screening required to reach the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency offices reinforced how different this work would be from anything I'd done previously. Agent Martinez met me in the lobby with credentials that would allow me to access the areas where I'd be observing incident response procedures. She looked tired in the way that suggested she'd been working around the clock since the power grid incident had begun. The situation we're dealing with is exactly the kind of threat that the Critical Infrastructure Protection Initiative was designed to address, she explained as we rode the elevator to the 15th floor. A coordinated attack on multiple power substations using techniques we haven't seen before. The Cyber Incident Response Center was unlike anything I'd imagined. Multiple teams of analysts worked at workstations equipped with sophisticated monitoring equipment, tracking the progression of the attack in real time while coordinating response efforts with utility companies and local law enforcement agencies. The adversaries we're dealing with have studied our infrastructure systems for months or possibly years, explained Director Robert Thompson, the senior FBI official overseeing the response effort. They understand our defensive procedures well enough to develop attack methods that exploit gaps in our current security protocols. Director Thompson was a man in his 50s with gray hair and the kind of calm authority that comes from years of managing crisis situations. He spoke with the precision of someone accustomed to briefing senior government officials on complex technical matters. This is exactly why we need innovative analysts who can anticipate attack patterns that haven't been used before, he continued, looking directly at me. Traditional approaches to cybersecurity assume that adversaries will follow predictable patterns, but these attacks demonstrate planning and sophistication that requires new analytical frameworks. Over the next 6 hours, I observed federal cybersecurity professionals coordinate response efforts that involved dozens of agencies and private sector partners. The complexity of protecting critical infrastructure became clear as I watched analysts track the attack's progression, while simultaneously working to prevent it from spreading to additional systems. What patterns do you see in the attack methodology? Agent Martinez asked during a brief break in the response activities. I'd been studying the technical data they'd shared with me, looking for the kind of anomalies that had helped me identify patterns in previous investigations. The timing suggests coordination between multiple attack vectors, but there's something about the sequencing that doesn't match typical sophisticated attacks. What do you mean? Director Thompson asked, his attention focused entirely on my analysis. Most coordinated attacks follow logical progression patterns that maximize damage while minimizing detection time. But this attack pattern includes delays and redundancies that suggest the adversaries are testing response procedures rather than trying to cause maximum immediate damage. The room became quiet as the implications of my observations sank in. If the attack was designed to test response procedures rather than cause immediate damage, it suggested that the adversaries were gathering intelligence for future, more serious attacks. That's exactly the kind of analytical thinking we need, Director Thompson said after a long pause. The ability to see beyond immediate technical indicators to understand strategic intent. Agent Martinez looked at me with an expression that suggested my observation had confirmed something important about my suitability for the program. Kyla, I think you're ready for the next phase of this process. The flight back to Denver gave me time to process what I'd experienced in Washington. For the first time in my professional life, I'd been in a room where my analytical skills were not just valued, but essential for addressing challenges that could affect national security. The validation was overwhelming, but it was also accompanied by a sense of responsibility that was unlike anything I'd felt before. 2 weeks later, I received the call that would change everything. David's voice carried the kind of excitement that comes from career-defining moments as he delivered news that I'd been hoping for but hadn't quite believed would actually happen. Kyla, you've been cleared for the program. Interim security clearance is approved. Final clearances pending completion of the process. But they want you in Washington to begin work immediately. The opportunity I'd been building toward without fully realizing it was finally materializing. Instead of being the family disappointment who couldn't quite find her direction in life, I was about to become a federal cybersecurity analyst, working on problems that could affect millions of people. When do they need me in Washington? I asked, though I was already mentally planning what I'd need to do to relocate for this opportunity. Monday. They want you integrated into the team before the formal program launch in January. As I hung up the phone and began planning the biggest career transition of my life, I thought about the conversation I'd have with my family about this development. For years, they'd struggled to understand what I did for work, or why my unconventional career path might lead somewhere meaningful. Now I was about to begin work that I couldn't discuss with them at all, but that represented everything I'd been trying to achieve professionally. The irony wasn't lost on me that my greatest career achievement would also be my most invisible one, at least from my family's perspective. But for the first time in my adult life, I felt confident that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly the work I was meant to do. The phone call to my parents that evening was one of the most difficult conversations I'd ever had with them. How do you explain to people who've always questioned your career choices that you're about to begin work you can't discuss with them? How do you help them understand that their concerns about your professional direction were unfounded without being able to share the details that would prove it? I'm relocating to Washington for a new position, I told my mother, keeping the explanation as simple as possible. What kind of position? Linda asked, her voice carrying the mixture of hope and skepticism that had characterized her responses to my career updates for years. Federal cybersecurity work. I can't share many details because of confidentiality requirements, but it's a significant opportunity with the Department of Homeland Security. The silence on the other end of the phone suggested that my mother was trying to process information that didn't fit her understanding of my career trajectory. Kyla, that sounds very important. Are you sure you're qualified for that level of responsibility? The question stung, but I understood why she'd asked it. From her perspective, I'd spent my 20s and early 30s working jobs that seemed disconnected from the kind of federal government position I was describing. I've been building toward this for years, Mom. All the work I've been doing with David's firm has been preparation for exactly this kind of opportunity. Well, that's wonderful, sweetheart. Your father and I are very proud of you. The words were supportive, but I could hear the uncertainty beneath them. My parents wanted to be proud of my achievement, but they didn't have enough context to understand what it actually meant. The work that would define the next phase of my career would remain largely invisible to the people whose approval I'd spent years seeking. But as I began planning my move to Washington and preparing for work that would challenge me in ways I'd never experienced before, I realized that external validation had become less important than the internal satisfaction of finally finding work that matched my skills and interests. After years of feeling like I didn't quite fit anywhere, I was about to begin a career that felt like it had also been designed specifically for me. Washington, D.C. in December felt like stepping into a different world entirely. The federal buildings, the serious-faced people in dark suits carrying briefcases, the sense that every conversation might involve information that could affect national policy. I'd found a small furnished apartment in Arlington, close enough to take the metro to downtown, but far enough away to feel like I could separate my personal life from the intensity of federal work. My first day at the Department of Homeland Security began at 6 in the morning, with a security briefing that covered everything from handling classified information to recognizing foreign intelligence surveillance. The conference room was filled with new program participants, most of whom had traditional backgrounds in federal law enforcement or military cybersecurity. I was clearly the outsider, the private sector consultant who'd somehow found her way into a room full of people with decades of government service. "Welcome to the Critical Infrastructure Protection Initiative," announced Deputy Director Michael Reeves, a tall man with the bearing of someone who'd spent years in high-pressure government positions. Over the next 6 months, you'll be working on threat assessment projects that will shape how this country protects its most essential systems. The magnitude of what we were undertaking became clear as Director Reeves outlined the scope of critical infrastructure vulnerabilities that our team would be analyzing. Power grids that supplied electricity to major metropolitan areas, water treatment systems that served millions of people, transportation networks that moved goods and people across the country, financial systems that processed trillions of dollars in daily transactions. The adversaries we're facing have capabilities that exceed anything we've dealt with in previous decades, he continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen classified intelligence reports that most people would never know existed. State-sponsored groups with resources and planning timelines that allow them to develop attack methods specifically designed to exploit our infrastructure vulnerabilities. My first assignment was to analyze attack patterns from a series of incidents that had occurred over the past 18 months, looking for connections and methodologies that might indicate coordinated planning by sophisticated adversaries. The data I was given access to was unlike anything I'd worked with before, detailed technical information about attacks on systems that I'd never known were vulnerable. The work required a different kind of thinking than anything I'd done in private sector cybersecurity consulting. Instead of analyzing individual security breaches for specific organizations, I was looking for patterns across multiple incidents that might reveal strategic planning by adversaries whose capabilities rivaled those of nation-states. Kyla, I'd like you to focus specifically on timing patterns, explained Dr. Sarah Chen, the program's lead technical analyst and someone whose expertise in cybersecurity was legendary within federal law enforcement circles. We have reason to believe that some of these incidents weren't random attacks but coordinated probes designed to test our response capabilities. Dr. Chen was a woman in her late 40s who'd built her career analyzing some of the most sophisticated cyber threats the country had faced. Her approach to pattern recognition was methodical and precise, but she also encouraged innovative thinking that went beyond traditional analytical frameworks. Working with the data she provided, I began to see connections that had been invisible when the incidents were analyzed individually. Attack timing that corresponded to specific federal agency work schedules, target selection that suggested detailed knowledge of infrastructure interdependencies, methodologies that seemed designed to gather intelligence about response procedures rather than cause maximum immediate damage. Dr. Chen, I think I'm seeing something significant in the temporal patterns, I said during our weekly analysis meeting. These attacks aren't just testing individual systems, they're mapping our entire response infrastructure. She looked up from her computer screen with the kind of focused attention that suggested my observation had confirmed something she'd been suspecting. Show me what you're seeing. I pulled up the analysis I'd been working on, displaying attack timelines alongside federal response activities and infrastructure interdependency maps. The pattern that emerged suggested adversaries who understood not just how to attack individual systems, but how to exploit the complex relationships between different types of infrastructure. If I'm reading this correctly, someone has been systematically mapping our critical infrastructure relationships, I continued, pointing to connections I'd identified between seemingly unrelated incidents. They're not just looking for individual vulnerabilities. They're understanding how attacking one system could cascade into failures across multiple types of infrastructure. Dr. Chen stared at my analysis for several minutes, her expression becoming increasingly serious as she processed the implications of what I'd discovered. Kyla, this suggests a level of strategic planning that we haven't seen before. If adversaries are mapping infrastructure interdependencies, they're preparing for attacks that could affect multiple essential systems simultaneously. The discovery represented exactly the kind of threat analysis that the Critical Infrastructure Protection Initiative had been created to address, but it also meant that the vulnerabilities we were dealing with were more extensive than anyone had initially realized. We need to brief Director Thompson on this immediately, Dr. Chen said, reaching for her secure phone. This kind of intelligence could influence how the federal government approaches infrastructure protection policy. The briefing with Director Thompson took place in a secure conference room that required additional security clearances to access. The walls were lined with monitors displaying real-time data about infrastructure systems across the country, creating an environment that felt like a command center for national security operations. Ms. Williams, Dr. Chen tells me you've identified patterns that suggest coordinated intelligence gathering by sophisticated adversaries, Director Thompson said, his attention completely focused on the analysis I'd prepared. Walk me through what you've discovered. I explained the temporal correlations I'd identified, the target selection patterns that suggested detailed knowledge of infrastructure relationships, and the methodologies that appeared designed to test response capabilities rather than cause immediate damage. Director Thompson listened without interruption, occasionally asking technical questions that demonstrated his deep understanding of cybersecurity challenges. The implications of this analysis are significant, he said after I'd finished my presentation. If adversaries are mapping infrastructure interdependencies, we need to fundamentally rethink how we approach critical system protection. Dr. Chen leaned forward in her chair, her expression reflecting the gravity of the situation we were discussing. Director, this suggests that traditional approaches to infrastructure security may be inadequate for the threats we're facing. We're dealing with adversaries who are planning attacks that could affect multiple essential systems simultaneously. What recommendations do you have for addressing these vulnerabilities? Director Thompson asked, looking directly at me. The question caught me off guard. 6 months ago, I'd been explaining to my family that cybersecurity consulting was a legitimate career. Now I was being asked to provide recommendations that could influence federal infrastructure protection policy. We need to develop response capabilities that account for simultaneous attacks on interdependent systems, I said, surprised by the confidence in my own voice. Current response protocols assume individual incidents, but these patterns suggest adversaries are planning coordinated attacks that could overwhelm traditional response procedures. Director Thompson made notes as I spoke, clearly taking my recommendations seriously enough to consider them for policy implementation. Ms. Williams, I want you to develop a comprehensive threat model based on your analysis. Something we can use to brief senior government officials on the nature of the threats we're facing. The assignment represented the kind of responsibility I'd never imagined when I'd started working in cybersecurity. My analysis would be used to inform decisions made by people whose names appeared in newspaper headlines, officials whose choices affected national security policy and resource allocation. Over the following weeks, I worked with Dr. Chen and other program analysts to develop what became known as the Coordinated Infrastructure Threat Assessment, a comprehensive analysis of how sophisticated adversaries might exploit infrastructure interdependencies to cause widespread disruptions. The document was classified at levels that required security clearances I was still in the process of obtaining. But the unclassified summary would eventually influence how multiple federal agencies approached infrastructure protection planning. Kyla, this work is exactly why we created this program, Dr. Chen told me during one of our late evening analysis sessions. The threats we're facing require innovative thinking from people who can see patterns that traditional approaches miss. The validation was meaningful, but it was also accompanied by a growing sense of responsibility that was unlike anything I'd experienced in my professional life. The work I was doing would remain invisible to most people, including my family, but it could affect the security of systems that millions of people depended on every day. 3 months into the program, I received news that would change my understanding of my role in federal cybersecurity work. Dr. Chen called me into her office with an expression that suggested she was about to share information that would significantly impact my career trajectory. Kyla, your work on coordinated threat analysis has attracted attention at the highest levels of federal law enforcement, she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone delivering career-defining news. The FBI director wants to meet with you personally to discuss your findings and recommendations. The thought of briefing the FBI director was both thrilling and terrifying. Dr. Chen, I've only been working in federal cybersecurity for 3 months. Are you sure I'm prepared for that level of responsibility? The FBI director specifically requested to meet with the analyst who developed the Coordinated Infrastructure Threat Model, she replied. Your work has provided insights that are influencing how the federal government approaches critical infrastructure protection. The meeting was scheduled for the following week at FBI headquarters, in the director's conference room where briefings on national security matters took place. I'd never been inside the FBI building before, and the layers of security required to reach the director's office reinforced how significant this opportunity actually was. Director James Patterson was a man in his 60s with gray hair and the kind of calm authority that comes from decades of experience in federal law enforcement. He'd built his career handling some of the most complex national security challenges the country had faced, and his reputation for analytical thinking was legendary within government circles. Ms. Williams, I've been studying your analysis of coordinated infrastructure threats, he began, looking directly at me with the kind of focused attention that made it clear this wasn't a courtesy meeting. Your work has identified vulnerabilities that we hadn't fully understood before. The conference room was filled with senior FBI officials, whose names I recognized from news reports about national security investigations. The fact that they were all listening to my analysis with serious attention was surreal in a way that made me question whether this was actually happening. Director Patterson. The patterns I identified suggest that adversaries are planning attacks that could affect multiple types of infrastructure simultaneously, I explained, trying to project confidence despite the intimidating nature of the audience. Traditional response procedures assume individual incidents, but these threats require coordinated defensive strategies. What specific recommendations do you have for addressing these vulnerabilities? He asked, his tone suggesting that my answer would influence actual policy decisions. I outlined the defensive strategies I'd developed with Dr. Chen's team, focusing on coordination between different types of infrastructure operators and response procedures that could handle simultaneous attacks on interdependent systems. Director Patterson listened without interruption, occasionally making notes that I assumed would be shared with other senior government officials. Ms. Williams, your analysis has provided insights that are essential for protecting national security, he said after I had finished my presentation. I want you to lead the development of new response protocols based on your threat assessment work. The assignment was unlike anything I'd imagined when I'd started working in federal cybersecurity. Leading the development of response protocols meant that my work would directly influence how the federal government protected critical infrastructure systems. Director, I'm honored by your confidence in my work, but I want to make sure I understand the scope of what you're asking, I replied, trying to process the magnitude of the responsibility he was offering. You'll be working directly with my office to develop comprehensive response strategies for coordinated infrastructure attacks, he explained. Your recommendations will be implemented across multiple federal agencies and shared with private sector partners who operate critical systems. The opportunity represented everything I'd been working toward without fully realizing it, but it also meant accepting responsibility for work that could affect national security in ways I was still learning to understand. I accept the assignment, Director Patterson. I'll do everything possible to develop effective response strategies for these threats. As I left FBI headquarters that afternoon, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd eventually have with my family about this development. For years, they'd struggled to understand what I did for work, or why my unconventional career path might lead somewhere meaningful. Now I was leading the development of federal response protocols, but I couldn't share any details about the work that had finally proven the value of my professional choices. The irony was significant, but it was also liberating in a way I hadn't expected. Instead of seeking external validation for my career decisions, I was finally doing work that felt inherently meaningful, regardless of whether anyone else understood its importance. 2 weeks later, I was working late in my office when Dr. Chen appeared in my doorway with an expression that suggested she had news that would surprise me. Kyla, I just received a call from Director Patterson's office, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. They want you to brief the National Security Council on your infrastructure threat analysis. The National Security Council was the highest level of government, where national security policy was discussed and decided. The thought of presenting my work to officials who advised the president on security matters was overwhelming in a way that made me question whether I was actually qualified for this level of responsibility. Dr. Chen, are you certain they want me specifically? I've only been working in federal cybersecurity for a few months. Director Patterson specifically requested that you present your analysis because you developed the threat model and understand the implications better than anyone else, she replied. Kyla, this is the kind of opportunity that most analysts never get, even after decades of federal service. The briefing was scheduled for the following month, giving me time to prepare a presentation that would communicate complex technical concepts to senior government officials whose decisions could affect national policy and resource allocation. Working with Dr. Chen and other program analysts, I developed a presentation that focused on the strategic implications of coordinated infrastructure threats, rather than technical details that might not be relevant for policymakers. The goal was to help senior officials understand how sophisticated adversaries might exploit infrastructure vulnerabilities and what defensive strategies would be most effective for preventing or responding to such attacks. Remember that your audience includes people who make decisions about federal budget allocations and policy priorities, Dr. Chen advised during one of our preparation sessions. Your presentation needs to clearly explain why coordinated infrastructure threats represent a national security priority that requires immediate attention and resources. The National Security Council briefing took place in a secure conference room in the West Wing of the White House, a location that made the significance of the opportunity impossible to ignore. The room was filled with senior officials whose names appeared regularly in national news coverage of government policy and security matters. Ms. Williams, we understand that your analysis has identified new categories of threats to critical infrastructure systems, said National Security Advisor Rebecca Morrison, a woman whose reputation for strategic thinking had made her one of the most influential voices in government security policy. That's correct, Ms. Morrison. My analysis suggests that sophisticated adversaries are developing attack capabilities that could affect multiple types of infrastructure simultaneously, creating cascading failures that would overwhelm traditional response procedures. I presented my findings with the kind of confidence that surprised me, explaining complex threat patterns and defensive strategies to an audience that included people who advised the president on national security matters. The validation of having my work taken seriously at this level was overwhelming, but it was also accompanied by a profound sense of responsibility for the accuracy and implications of my analysis. What resources would be required to implement the defensive strategies you're recommending? Asked the Secretary of Homeland Security, whose department would be responsible for much of the implementation. The strategies I'm proposing would require coordination between federal agencies, state and local governments, and private sector infrastructure operators, I explained. Implementation would involve training programs, equipment upgrades, and new communication protocols that could prevent adversaries from exploiting infrastructure interdependencies. The discussion that followed my presentation lasted for over an hour, with senior officials asking detailed questions about implementation timelines, cost estimates, and coordination requirements. The fact that my recommendations were being seriously considered for national policy implementation was surreal, in a way that made me question whether this was actually happening. Ms. Williams, your analysis has provided insights that are essential for protecting national security, National Security Advisor Morrison said as the briefing concluded. I want you to work directly with my office to oversee implementation of your recommended defensive strategies. The assignment meant that I would be working at the highest levels of government on policies that could affect how the country protected its most essential systems. It was the kind of responsibility that I'd never imagined when I'd started my unconventional journey into cybersecurity consulting. As I left the White House that afternoon, I thought about calling my parents to share news about the most significant career achievement of my life. But the classified nature of my work meant that I couldn't discuss any details about what I was actually doing or why it was important. The conversation I had with my mother that evening was necessarily vague, but I could hear the pride in her voice when I mentioned that I was working on important projects with senior government officials. Kyla, it sounds like you found exactly the right career path, Linda said, her tone reflecting a level of respect for my professional choices that I'd never heard before. Your father and I always knew you were capable of great things. The validation was meaningful, but it was also complicated by the fact that I couldn't share the details that would help them understand what I'd actually accomplished. My greatest professional achievement would remain largely invisible to the people whose approval I'd spent years seeking. But for the first time in my adult life, external validation felt less important than the internal satisfaction of doing work that matched my skills and interests. Working directly with the National Security Council meant that my daily routine transformed into something I could never have imagined during my years of struggling to find my professional direction. Instead of commuting to a converted warehouse in Denver, I was now taking secured transportation to meetings in government buildings where decisions affecting national policy were made on a regular basis. The implementation of coordinated infrastructure defense strategies required building relationships with officials across multiple federal agencies, state governments, and private sector organizations that operated critical systems. Every day brought meetings with people whose expertise had been developed through decades of specialized government service, and I found myself serving as a bridge between technical cybersecurity analysis and policy implementation. Kyla, your ability to translate complex threat analysis into actionable policy recommendations is exactly what we need for this initiative, explained Deputy National Security Advisor Thomas Richardson during one of our weekly coordination meetings. Most technical experts struggle to communicate with policymakers, and most policy experts don't understand the technical implications of cybersecurity threats. Richardson was a career government official whose experience included senior positions in multiple administrations, and his endorsement of my work carried significant weight within the national security establishment. He'd become my primary contact for coordinating implementation activities across different government departments. The defensive strategies I developed required unprecedented cooperation between organizations that had traditionally operated independently. Power companies needed to coordinate with telecommunications providers, water utilities needed to share information with transportation authorities, and federal agencies needed to develop new protocols for supporting private sector infrastructure operators during coordinated attacks. The challenge we're facing is cultural as much as technical, I explained during a briefing with infrastructure sector representatives. These defensive strategies require organizations to share information and coordinate responses in ways that many have never done before. The audience included senior executives from companies that operated power grids, water treatment facilities, telecommunications networks, and transportation systems across the country. These were people who'd built their careers managing complex technical operations, but who now needed to think about cybersecurity in terms of interdependent vulnerabilities rather than individual system protection. Ms. Williams, the coordination protocols you're proposing would require significant changes to how we handle security incidents, said Patricia Evans, a senior executive with one of the country's largest electric utilities. Our current procedures assume that we're dealing with threats to our own systems, not coordinated attacks that could affect multiple types of infrastructure. That's exactly why these changes are necessary, I replied, pulling up analysis that demonstrated how adversaries could exploit the gaps between different infrastructure operators. The threats we're facing now are designed specifically to take advantage of the fact that different types of infrastructure have traditionally operated independently. The presentation included detailed scenarios showing how attacks on power systems could cascade into failures affecting water treatment, telecommunications, and transportation networks. The interdependencies were complex enough that most infrastructure operators had never fully understood how vulnerable their systems were to disruptions originating in other sectors. The coordination protocols I'm recommending would create communication channels and response procedures that could prevent these cascading failures, I continued, outlining specific steps that different types of infrastructure operators could take to support each other during coordinated attacks. Over the following months, I found myself traveling across the country to work with regional infrastructure operators, federal field offices, and state government agencies that would be responsible for implementing the new defensive strategies. Each location brought different challenges and required adapting the coordination protocols to local circumstances and organizational cultures. The work was demanding in ways that went far beyond technical analysis. I was essentially serving as a change management consultant for organizations that needed to fundamentally alter how they approach cybersecurity, while also maintaining the operational efficiency that kept essential services running for millions of people. The most difficult part of this implementation isn't technical. It's convincing people to change procedures they've used successfully for years, I told Dr. Chen during one of our periodic check-in calls. Infrastructure operators are naturally conservative because the consequences of operational failures are so significant. That's why your background in private sector consulting has been so valuable, she replied. You understand how to work with organizations that need to balance security improvements with operational requirements. The insight was accurate in ways that I was still learning to appreciate. My unconventional career path, which had seemed like a liability during family gatherings, had actually provided exactly the combination of technical expertise and business acumen needed for this type of cross-sector coordination work. 6 months into the implementation process, I received a call that would mark another significant transition in my role within federal cybersecurity work. Director Patterson's office requested a meeting to discuss new responsibilities that would expand my involvement in national security policy development. Ms. Williams, the success of the coordinated infrastructure defense implementation has demonstrated your capability to manage complex projects that involve multiple government agencies and private sector partners, Director Patterson explained during our meeting at FBI headquarters. I want to offer you a permanent position as Senior Advisor for Infrastructure Security Policy. The title represented a level of responsibility within federal cybersecurity work that I'd never imagined achieving, especially not within the first year of my government service. Director Patterson, I'm honored by your confidence in my work, but I want to make sure I understand what this position would involve. You'd be responsible for developing cybersecurity policies that affect critical infrastructure protection across all federal agencies, he replied. Your recommendations would influence how the government approaches emerging threats and allocates resources for infrastructure security programs. The scope of influence that came with such a position was both exciting and intimidating. Instead of working on individual projects, I'd be shaping the overall direction of federal cybersecurity policy in ways that could affect how the country protected its most essential systems for years to come. The position would also involve regular briefings with senior government officials, including the President's National Security Team, Director Patterson continued. Your analysis would directly influence decision-making at the highest levels of government. The opportunity represented the culmination of everything I'd been working toward, but it also meant accepting responsibility for work that could have consequences I was still learning to understand fully. I accept the position, Director Patterson. I'm committed to developing policies that will effectively protect critical infrastructure from the threats we're facing. The transition to my new role required security clearances at levels that involved even more comprehensive background investigations and regular polygraph examinations. The process reinforced how different my life had become from anything I could have anticipated when I'd been working as a bartender while teaching myself cybersecurity fundamentals. My first major assignment as senior advisor was to develop a comprehensive national strategy for protecting critical infrastructure from state-sponsored cyber attacks. The project required coordinating with intelligence agencies, military cybersecurity units, and international partners who were facing similar threats from sophisticated adversaries. The strategy you're developing will influence how the United States approaches cyber warfare defense for the next decade, explained CIA Deputy Director Janet Foster during one of our coordination meetings. Your recommendations will affect everything from intelligence collection priorities to military cyber defense capabilities. Deputy Director Foster was a woman whose career had been built analyzing threats from foreign intelligence services, and her perspective on state-sponsored cyber attacks provided context that was essential for understanding the strategic implications of the work I was doing. The adversaries we're dealing with have capabilities that rival our own in some areas, she continued, sharing classified intelligence that demonstrated the sophistication of threats facing critical infrastructure systems. They've been studying our vulnerabilities for years and developing attack methods specifically designed to exploit the interdependencies you identified in your earlier analysis. The intelligence briefings I received as part of developing the national strategy provided a sobering perspective on the scope of threats facing the country. Foreign government cyber units with hundreds of skilled analysts, attack planning that extended over multiple years, capabilities for causing disruptions that could affect millions of people simultaneously. The defensive strategies I'm proposing need to account for adversaries who have studied our systems as extensively as we've studied theirs, I explained during a briefing with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Traditional approaches to cybersecurity assume reactive defense, but these threats require proactive strategies that can anticipate and prevent coordinated attacks. The military leadership listened to my analysis with the kind of serious attention that reinforced how critical cybersecurity had become for national defense. Generals whose careers had been built understanding conventional warfare were now grappling with threats that could cause more disruption than traditional military attacks. Ms. Williams, your strategy recommendations will influence how we integrate cyber defense capabilities into overall national security planning, said General Michael Torres, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This represents a fundamental shift in how we think about protecting the homeland. The validation from senior military leadership was meaningful, but it was also accompanied by a growing awareness of how much responsibility I was carrying for work that could affect national security in ways that most people would never know about. 9 months into my role as senior advisor, I received an invitation that would mark the most significant recognition of my career achievements to date. The president had requested a personal briefing on critical infrastructure, cybersecurity threats, and I was selected to provide the analysis that would inform his understanding of these issues. Kyla, this is the highest level of recognition possible for cybersecurity policy work, Deputy National Security Advisor Richardson explained when he delivered the invitation. Presidential briefings are reserved for issues that require direct attention from the Commander-in-Chief. The preparation for a presidential briefing required weeks of work with multiple government agencies to develop analysis that would communicate complex technical concepts clearly while providing actionable recommendations for policy decisions. Every aspect of the presentation was reviewed by senior officials whose expertise had been developed through decades of specialized government service. Remember that your audience is someone who needs to understand the strategic implications of cybersecurity threats without getting lost in technical details, advised National Security Advisor Morrison during one of our preparation sessions. The president needs to understand why these issues matter for national security and what resources might be required to address them effectively. The briefing took place in the Oval Office on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 18 months after I'd received the call from David about the federal consulting opportunity that had changed my career trajectory. The room was smaller than I'd expected, but the historical significance of the location made it impossible to ignore the magnitude of the opportunity I'd been given. Ms. Williams, I understand that your analysis has identified new categories of threats to our critical infrastructure, the president said, looking directly at me with the kind of focused attention that suggested this wasn't a ceremonial meeting. That's correct, Mr. President. My research indicates that sophisticated adversaries are developing capabilities to attack multiple types of infrastructure simultaneously, creating cascading failures that could affect essential services for millions of Americans. I presented my analysis with confidence that surprised me, explaining complex threat patterns and defensive strategies to someone whose decisions could affect national policy and resource allocation at the highest level. The validation of having my work taken seriously by the president was overwhelming, but it was also accompanied by a profound sense of responsibility for the accuracy and implications of my recommendations. What would be required to implement the defensive strategies you're proposing? The president asked, his tone suggesting that my answer would influence actual budget decisions and policy priorities. The strategies I'm recommending would require coordination between federal agencies, state and local governments, and private sector infrastructure operators, I explained. Implementation would involve training programs, equipment upgrades, and new communication protocols that could cost several $billion, but would protect systems that are essential for national and economic security. The discussion that followed lasted for nearly an hour, with the president asking detailed questions about implementation timelines, international cooperation requirements, and the potential consequences of not addressing these vulnerabilities. The fact that my recommendations were being seriously considered for national policy implementation at this level was surreal in a way that made me question whether this was actually happening. Ms. Williams, your analysis has convinced me that critical infrastructure cybersecurity deserves immediate attention as a national security priority, the president said as the briefing concluded. I want you to work directly with my national security team to develop implementation plans that can be included in next year's federal budget. The assignment meant that my work would directly influence how the federal government allocated resources for cybersecurity programs, affecting policies that could shape national security planning for years to come. As I left the White House that afternoon, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 2 years ago, I'd been sitting at my nephew's graduation party, listening to family members question whether I'd ever find meaningful professional direction. Now I was walking out of the Oval Office after briefing the president on policies that could affect national security. The transformation felt surreal, but it was also accompanied by a sense of purpose that was unlike anything I'd experienced in my professional life. Instead of working on projects that generated income, I was now doing work that could protect systems essential for millions of people, while addressing threats that could affect national security. That evening, I called my parents to share news about the meeting, though I couldn't discuss any details about what had been discussed or why it was significant. Kyla, it sounds like you're doing incredibly important work, my father Robert said, his voice carrying a level of respect for my professional achievements that I'd never heard before. We always knew you were capable of great things, but this exceeds anything we could have imagined. The validation was meaningful, but it was also complicated by the fact that I couldn't share the details that would help them understand what I'd actually accomplished. My greatest professional achievements would remain largely invisible to my family, but for the first time in my adult life, external approval felt less important than the internal satisfaction of doing work that matched my capabilities and interests. The following week brought news that would mark another significant transition in my role within federal cybersecurity policy. Director Patterson called to inform me that my work had attracted attention from international partners who were facing similar threats from sophisticated adversaries. Kyla, the defensive strategies you've developed are being studied by our allies as potential models for their own critical infrastructure protection programs, he explained during our meeting. I want you to lead an international working group that will coordinate cybersecurity policy development with partner nations. The assignment would involve traveling to meetings with cybersecurity officials from countries that shared intelligence and coordinated responses to threats from state-sponsored adversaries. It represented another expansion of my responsibilities that would influence cybersecurity policy development beyond the United States. This position would make you one of the most influential cybersecurity policy experts in the world, Director Patterson continued. Your recommendations would affect how democratic nations coordinate their responses to threats that cross international boundaries. The scope of influence that came with such a position was both exciting and daunting. Instead of focusing solely on protecting American infrastructure, I'd be working to develop international cooperation strategies that could affect cybersecurity policy across multiple countries. I accept the assignment, Director Patterson. International coordination is essential for addressing threats that don't respect national boundaries. As I left his office and began planning for work that would take me to meetings with senior government officials in allied countries, I reflected on how fundamentally my life had changed since that conversation with my family at Tyler's graduation party. The sister who'd been viewed as the family disappointment was now representing the United States in international cybersecurity policy discussions. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it was also liberating in a way I hadn't expected. Instead of seeking validation from people who didn't understand my work, I was finally doing work that felt inherently meaningful, regardless of whether anyone else could appreciate its significance. My unconventional career path had led to exactly the kind of influential position I'd been working toward without fully realizing it. 3 years after that first meeting with the president, I found myself standing in the FBI director's conference room facing a situation that would have seemed impossible. During my years of family disappointment, the room was filled with senior officials from multiple agencies, all waiting for my assessment of a coordinated cyber attack that was threatening critical infrastructure across 7 states. "Ma'am, what are your orders?" Director Patterson asked, his voice carrying the deference that had become standard when addressing my recommendations during national security crises. The question hung in the air as I processed the real-time intelligence streaming across multiple monitors. Power grid anomalies, transportation system disruptions, telecommunications interference, all following the exact patterns I'd predicted in my threat assessments. The adversaries were executing a coordinated attack designed to exploit infrastructure interdependencies, but our defensive protocols were ready. "Initiate Coordinated Response Protocol 7, I directed, my voice steady despite the magnitude of the situation. Deploy federal cyber response teams to affected regions, activate private sector coordination channels, and implement isolation procedures for critical systems." The transformation from family embarrassment to someone whose orders mobilized federal resources during national security emergencies felt surreal, but it was also the natural culmination of years of dedicated work that had finally found its purpose. Every late night analyzing threat patterns, every briefing with skeptical infrastructure operators, every policy recommendation that had seemed theoretical was now proving its value in real-world crisis response. "Teams are deploying now," reported Agent Martinez, who'd become my primary coordinator for federal cyber incident response. "Regional infrastructure operators are implementing isolation protocols, and international partners are sharing relevant intelligence through channels you established." The defensive strategies I'd developed were working exactly as designed. Instead of allowing cascading failures to spread across multiple infrastructure types, the coordinated response was containing the attack and preventing the widespread disruptions that adversaries had planned. "Threat actors are attempting to adapt their methods," announced Dr. Chen, who now served as my deputy for technical analysis. "But our response protocols are successfully disrupting their coordination efforts." The moment represented everything I'd been working toward since that first federal consulting opportunity with David's firm. Years of feeling like I didn't quite fit anywhere had led to expertise in addressing problems that no one else had fully understood. My unconventional career path had provided exactly the combination of technical skills and innovative thinking needed for protecting critical systems from sophisticated threats. 4 hours later, the coordinated attack had been successfully contained with minimal disruption to essential services. The defensive protocols had worked precisely as intended, demonstrating the value of years of policy development and interagency coordination. "Outstanding work, Ms. Williams," Director Patterson said as the crisis response concluded. "Your leadership during this incident prevented what could have been one of the most significant infrastructure disruptions in our nation's history." The validation was meaningful, but it was also accompanied by the quiet satisfaction of knowing that millions of people had continued to have electricity, clean water, and communication services because of work that they would never know about. 2 months later, I received an invitation that would mark the ultimate recognition of my career achievements. The president was presenting the Presidential Medal of Freedom to civilians who had made exceptional contributions to national security, and my work in cybersecurity policy had earned me a place among the recipients. "Kyla Williams has revolutionized how America protects its most critical systems from sophisticated cyber threats," the president announced during the White House ceremony. "Her innovative analysis and policy development have prevented attacks that could have affected millions of Americans while establishing defensive strategies that serve as models for democratic nations worldwide." Standing in the East Room, surrounded by other recipients whose contributions to national service had shaped history, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The family gatherings where I'd felt invisible, the career changes that had seemed random to others, the years of building expertise in a field that most people didn't understand. My parents were in the audience, having traveled to Washington for the ceremony despite not fully understanding what I'd accomplished. The pride in their faces was unmistakable as they watched their daughter receive recognition from the president for work that had influenced national security policy. When I first started working in cybersecurity, I never imagined it would lead to this kind of recognition, I told the assembled guests during the reception. But I've learned that expertise and impact matter more than conventional career paths or family expectations. The comment was directed at my parents, who had spent years wondering whether I'd ever find meaningful professional direction. Now they were watching me receive the highest civilian honor for work that had contributed to protecting national security. "Kyla, we always knew you were capable of great things," my mother Linda said after the ceremony, her voice carrying emotions that reflected years of worry followed by overwhelming pride. "We just didn't understand how brilliant your unconventional path actually was." The conversation represented the validation I'd spent years seeking, but it also felt less important than it would have earlier in my career. The meaningful recognition came from seeing defensive strategies work during actual cyber attacks. From briefing senior officials whose decisions affected national policy. From knowing that my work contributed to protecting systems that millions of people depended on. 6 months after the Presidential Medal ceremony, I established the Williams Institute for Critical Infrastructure Security, a research organization dedicated to developing innovative approaches to cybersecurity threats. The institute brought together experts from government, academia, and private industry to address challenges that required exactly the kind of cross-sector thinking that had characterized my own career development. Our mission is to identify and address cybersecurity vulnerabilities before they can be exploited by sophisticated adversaries, I explained during the Institute's opening symposium. We're building on lessons learned from years of coordinated infrastructure defense to develop proactive strategies that can prevent the kinds of attacks we've successfully responded to. The Institute represented the next phase of my contribution to cybersecurity policy, moving beyond crisis response to anticipatory research that could identify and address emerging threats before they materialized into actual attacks. Kyla's Institute is pioneering approaches to cybersecurity that will influence how we protect critical systems for decades to come, Director Patterson said during his keynote address at the symposium. Her work demonstrates how innovative thinking and unconventional career paths can lead to expertise that benefits national security. Standing in the research facility that bore my name, surrounded by analysts whose work would influence cybersecurity policy for years to come, I reflected on the transformation from family disappointment to someone whose orders mobilized federal resources during national emergencies. The journey had required years of building expertise in areas that most people didn't understand, accepting work that seemed temporary while developing skills that would prove essential, and persisting through family gatherings where my choices were questioned by people who measured success through traditional metrics. But every challenge had contributed to the expertise that eventually enabled me to protect systems essential for millions of people while addressing threats that could affect national security. My unconventional path had led to exactly the kind of influential position I'd been seeking without fully understanding what it would involve. The phone call that came that evening was from my nephew Tyler, now completing his second year at Harvard Law School. "Aunt Kyla, I wanted you to know that you've become the example I point to when people ask about non-traditional career success," he said, his voice carrying admiration that would have seemed impossible during family gatherings where I'd felt invisible. "Sometimes the most important work requires building expertise in ways that don't follow conventional patterns," I replied, thinking about the years of exploration and learning that had prepared me for responsibilities I couldn't have anticipated. The conversation represented the full transformation of my role within family dynamics, from embarrassment to inspiration, from someone whose choices were questioned to someone whose achievements influenced how others thought about career development and professional success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.